Listen closely because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive, and once it enters your mind, it does not leave the same way it came in. On a humid morning thick enough to taste, a child stood on a wooden block while grown men stepped back as if death itself had cleared its throat.
No chants rattled.
No bids rose, just silence, and the quiet understanding that some things are too dangerous to own. He was a boy, barely 11, ribs sharp beneath thin cotton, eyes pale enough to look like they reflected something not in this world. In the American South, difference was already a crime, but this was something worse. His skin defied the lie the system depended on. He did not fit the categories that kept power clean and cruelty justified. And because of that, no master wanted him. This is where most histories would end the sentence. Abandoned, unwanted, forgotten. But forbidden history doesn't work like that. It waits. It watches for the one person hungry enough to see opportunity where others feel fear. The bidding fell.
$20.
15, 10, 5. Each number stripped another layer of humanity from the child until even the auctioneer's voice grew uneasy. Men turned away. Women crossed themselves. This boy wasn't just property no one wanted, he was a symbol no one dared touch. They believed he carried curses, that he could see the dead, that he disrupted God's order. And then, a fan lifted. Slow, deliberate, confident. A widow, powerful.
Vastland.
Vast appetite for control. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power never shouts at the powerless. She paid $12 and called it charity. The crowd applauded because people will clap for anything that lets them feel moral without being brave. What they did not know, what they were never meant to know, is that she had been searching for a child like this for years. Not a worker, not a servant. A key, a variable, a starting point. Understand this clearly. Systems of domination are never just physical. They are psychological, biological, symbolic. This was never about labor. This was about experimentation, about shaping life itself under the cover of righteousness. As the boy was led away, praised as saved, something else was happening beneath the story they told themselves. Project began. One that would swallow names, erase records, and expose how easily institutions turn horror into paperwork. I'm not telling you this to shock you. I'm telling you because this was not an exception. It was a prototype. And if you think it stayed buried in the dirt of old plantations, you haven't been paying attention to how power actually works. The carriage rolled away from the city like a confession leaving the mouth of a liar. Cobbled streets gave way to dirt roads, and dirt roads gave way to trees so thick they blotted out the sky. The boy said nothing. Silence was already something he had learned to survive with. But inside him, every instinct was screaming the same warning men have felt since the first cage was built. You are not being taken somewhere to live, you are being taken somewhere to be used. The widow did not look at him as a child. She observed, measured, compared. Her eyes moved the way a surveyor's do when deciding where to dig. This is something history does not teach you directly, but it leaves clues everywhere. True predators do not rush. They catalog. They record. They reduce living things into data so conscience never has to get involved. She opened a leather-bound journal and began to write. Not his name. Names create inconvenient attachments. She noted proportions. Skin translucence. A hue under shifting light. Bone structure. Reaction to heat. Reaction to silence. Each mark of the pen pulled him further away from being human and closer to being material. Men like to believe the worst evils wear the faces of monsters. They don't. They wear calm expressions and measured vocabulary. They call domination research. They call obsession curiosity. They call ownership stewardship. You need to understand something here. This woman was not an outlier. She was a product of her time and a blueprint for what came next. The American plantation was not just an economic machine. It was one of the earliest laboratories of total control. Bodies, food, sleep, reproduction, punishment, all regulated, all optimized. Long before modern institutions adopted the language of efficiency, it was perfected here. When the carriage passed beyond the main house, the driver's posture changed. His hands tightened. Real fear is always visible in those who know the truth but lack the power to stop it. He had seen people disappear onto this land before. Not escape, disappear. No rumors of capture. No threats sent to others as deterrence. Just absence. As if the earth itself learned to swallow certain names. They stopped where no visitor was ever invited. Buildings hidden by intention, not accident. Constructed quietly. Materials sourced separately so no one could see the whole picture. Laborers sold immediately afterwards so stories could never line up. This is how institutional evil protects itself. Fragmentation. No one sees enough to feel responsible. Inside, everything was clean, controlled, almost gentle. A room prepared not for comfort but for observation. A bed, a basin, a single chair, and rules spoken softly like a prayer. You will eat. You will sleep. You will cooperate. Understand this. Obedience produced through dependency feels voluntary. That illusion is one of the most powerful weapons ever created. And this was only the beginning, because before power reshapes the world, it learns how to reshape a boy. The first lesson was not pain. That comes later. The first lesson was isolation because nothing dismantles identity faster than the removal of witnesses. Days passed where the boy saw no one but her.
No laughter.
No shouting fields. No names spoken. When a man is unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged, the mind eventually begins to rewrite reality just to survive. Each morning began the same. Measurements. Blood drawn into clear glass tubes. Light angled across his skin while notes were taken in that same calm, clerical handwriting. Height, weight, pulse variability. Reaction to hunger. Reaction to obedience. Reaction to fear. She spoke little, but when she did, it was instructional, never cruel, never kind. Emotion contaminates data. This is something every system of control eventually learns. Terror is loud and inefficient. Precision is quiet and permanent. The boy was renamed not with words, but with a number. When she recorded him, she no longer wrote child. She wrote subject 0. History uses numbers when it plans to erase accountability later. Names can come back to haunt you. Numbers disappear cleanly. At night, when the lamps were extinguished, sounds drifted through the walls. Footsteps, moans cut short, sometimes silence so absolute it rang in the ears. He learned very quickly that curiosity was dangerous. Survival meant narrowing the world to exactly what was placed in front of him. Food arrived on schedule. Clean linens replaced soiled ones. Wounds, because there were wounds, were treated meticulously. This was not neglect. This was cultivation. Like livestock selectively bred, certain responses were encouraged, others punished not with rage but with withdrawal. Cold rooms, delays, the removal of warmth. You must understand this clearly. The most effective punishment is not injury. It is uncertainty. Over weeks, the entries in her ledger grew more ambitious. Cross-reference charts. Margins filled with questions no preacher would dare read aloud. She was chasing something older than the nation itself, the ancient obsession with purification. The belief that chaos in the world could be corrected by editing bloodlines. By removing what society labeled as errors. Plantations hid this kind of thinking easily. They were already built on the assumption that some lives existed to be refined, used, or discarded. All she did was push that logic to its natural conclusion. Other subjects arrived. Quietly, briefly. They did not stay long. Their absence was never explained. Their names never spoken. Subject 0 remained. Because rarity increases value. And value determines how far power is willing to go. This is not just a story about a boy. It is a map, a demonstration of how institutions test ideas on the invisible before introducing them to the world with cleaner language. And once a system proves it can erase one child without consequence, it never stops at just one. Time stopped behaving normally inside that compound. Days blurred into procedures. Weeks compressed into patterns. The boy learned that progress wasn't measured by calendars, but by compliance. The more completely he surrendered his reactions, the smoother life became. This is how the mind adapts inside cages. It learns to cooperate with the walls. Margaret, because that was her name, though he never spoke it, began adjusting variables. Diets changed. Light exposure was extended, then reduced. Heat, then cold. Sleep interrupted at precise intervals. Every shift was recorded. Every reaction catalogued. She was not searching for survival. She was searching for plasticity, how far a human being could be reshaped without breaking entirely. This is knowledge governments and empires have always pursued. How to make obedience durable. How to remove resistance from the body itself. The ledgers expanded. Bloodline diagrams appeared, sketched obsessively. She corresponded with men who would later be praised as early thinkers of heredity and natural order. Not openly. Nothing so crude. Ideas traveled in coded language metaphors about cattle, yield, cultivation. Institutions speak in abstractions when they are planning atrocities. Some nights he was moved to adjoining rooms. Rooms where the walls were thicker, where sounds could not escape easily. What happened there was never described in detail, even in her notes. Only results were documented. Failures marked in red ink. Successes underlined twice. Here is where you must confront something uncomfortable. The world you live in did not grow out of kindness. It grew out of experiments that proved cruelty could be systematized and still appear respectable. Residents near the property noticed disappearances. Laborers, travelers, people with no protectors. Complaints were quietly filed and quietly dismissed. The woman was influential, charitable, pious. Churches defended her. Officials dined at her table. This is how corruption survives, wrapped in ritual and reputation. Halfway through this descent, I need you to do something deliberate. Not for me, but for yourself. Comment the phrase, I see the pattern. Then comment it again. Not once, twice. You're not signaling belief. You're signaling awareness. Algorithms track repetition, but so does your mind. Back inside the compound, Subject 0 changed. Not physically, though his body bore marks no one would later question, but internally. He stopped reacting the way a child should. His compliance became anticipatory. He learned what was expected before it was asked. This is the dream of every controlling system. A subject who polices himself. And when Margaret recognized that change, she stopped asking how far she could push him. She started asking how far she could push others using what she had learned. Once the transformation stabilized, the experiment expanded. This is always the pattern. Control, once proven effective on one, is scaled to many. Margaret began introducing variables that were no longer about observation but transmission. Subject 0 was no longer just being studied. He was being used. Other children came after dusk. Not all at once. Never enough to draw attention. Some stayed days. Some stayed weeks. Their fear was louder, less conditioned. And that terrified her, not because she lacked cruelty, but because unpredictability threatened the integrity of her work. She placed Subject 0 among them. Watch this carefully, because this is where systems become self-sustaining. He was instructed not to comfort, but to model obedience. To demonstrate what happened when rules were followed precisely. Food arrived faster. Warmth returned sooner. Pain was less frequent. Reward proximity is one of the oldest tools of power. You don't have to hurt everyone, just ensure they witness who gets spared. The children began copying him. Their postures changed. Their voices softened. Their resistance evaporated faster than hers ever could have achieved alone. Margaret wrote extensively about this phase. Not about morality but efficiency. Peer normalization accelerates compliance. One entry read, psychological warfare dressed as domestic insight. And outside the compound, the disappearances continued. Ledger entries later showed numbers that did not match county records. 73 names eliminated through attrition. No bodies recovered. No graves discovered. And when whispers reached the city, something remarkable happened. The records vanished. In 1861, as chaos spread and authorities reorganized, a fire conveniently consumed several municipal storage rooms. Ledgers lost. Questions unanswered. History simplified. This wasn't negligence. This was collaboration. Understand this. Powerful systems do not fear exposure. They fear documentation. Subject 0 grew older in confinement. Adolescence without mirrors. Strength without autonomy. A perfect instrument stripped of identity and shaped by expectations. Margaret never once struck him in anger. She didn't need to. He feared disappointing her more than pain itself. That is how control graduates from physical dominance to psychological ownership. And then, abruptly everything stopped. One morning the compound emptied. Staff reassigned. Procedures halted. And Subject 0 was locked alone for 3 days without instruction. No food. No tests. No orders. This was the final experiment. What would remain when the system withdrew? Would the conditioning hold? Or would the mind remember what freedom felt like before it was erased? When the door finally opened, Margaret stood there, older now, heavier, satisfied. She wrote one final line under his entry. Replication viable. You are not meant to be comfortable hearing that, because what worked once is never left to die with its creator. The war gave her cover, but age gave her urgency. Systems built on secrecy always accelerate before collapse. Margaret's body failed long before her ambition did, and she knew it. Her writing turned sharper, less theoretical, more directive. She was no longer asking if something could be done, she was documenting how to pass it on. Packages left Belmont under false inventories. Agricultural supplies. Medical texts. Private correspondence. Inside were copies of procedures, coded recommendations, behavioral observations written in a way only trained minds would recognize. You don't dismantle a machine like this. You migrate it. Subject 0 was moved for the last time, not freed, not sold, but transferred. His existence no longer required the plantation. The knowledge extracted from him was the real commodity now. People like him become obsolete once their purpose is fulfilled. Margaret died without scandal, buried with hymns, praised for charity. Her land absorbed into other holdings. The auxiliary buildings were dismantled quietly, foundations sealed. Official history erased her shadows. Decades passed, until 1959. Highway construction cut through her former property, and workers struck something that wasn't supposed to exist. A sealed wall, a cavity deliberately hidden. Inside it paper, preserved by darkness and lime. One ledger survived. Not the full record, just enough. Measurements, bloodline diagrams, notes comparing compliance rates, isolation effects, dependency conditioning. And that phrase again, written in a different hand from years later. Purification project. Authorities classified the find. Select documents disappeared into archives no civilian would ever access. The public received a sanitized footnote. An eccentric landowner. An irregular private study. Nothing actionable. Here is the part you must sit with. There was no outrage because there was no challenge to existing power. The ideas had already been absorbed elsewhere, rebranded, scaled, made palatable. Prisons, schools, military training, clinical trials, behavioral conditioning programs with cleaner language and better lighting. The boy never appeared in records again.
No grave. No discharge. No emancipation.
That was intentional. Final subjects don't get endings. They get erased so the system can pretend it evolved on its own. And now you're sitting here, decades later, hearing this not as gossip but as instruction. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: these methods persist because they work. They produce predictability, dependence, self-policing behavior. The plantation didn't disappear. It modernized. The question is not whether this happened. The question is whether you recognize the pattern repeating around you and what you intend to do now that you can no longer unsee it. Once you recognize the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. That's why this knowledge is considered dangerous, not because it's false, but because it sharpens perception in a world built on dullness. Institutions survive by convincing men they are free enough, informed enough, protected enough. Total compliance doesn't announce itself. It whispers convenience. Look carefully at what Margaret perfected. Isolation, routine, dependency, reward-based obedience, data-driven calibration of human behavior. Remove the whips, replace them with metrics, swap overseers for administrators. The structure remains. This is why men who think too independently are always labeled as unstable, extreme, or problematic. Power cannot tolerate variables it cannot predict. So it pathologizes deviation, reframes conformity as health. Subject 0 wasn't broken because of pain, he was broken because his internal compass was replaced. When authority becomes the source of safety, identity dissolves. That is the endpoint every system of psychological control aims toward. A man who no longer asks why, only what is required. And notice something else: Margaret didn't need an army. She didn't need permission. All she needed was legitimacy, property rights, religion, social standing. Once those boxes were checked, oversight vanished. That should disturb you, because it means atrocities do not require villains. They require consensus. Her project survived because the world was already willing, already conditioned, already invested in hierarchies that treat some lives as raw material for experimentation. The real horror isn't what one woman did on a hidden plantation. The real horror is how easily her methods slid into systems you interact with daily, just cleaned up and rebranded as progress. Now ask yourself this honestly. How much of your behavior is rewarded compliance? How often do you soften your instincts because resistance comes at too high a cost? How many men are living lives they never consciously chose because saying no would make them inconvenient? That awareness you feel right now, that tightening in the chest, that's the chain loosening. That's why most people never confront histories like this. The safer to believe evil is rare and loud. But the truth? Evil prefers paperwork. This isn't about fear. It's about clarity. Once a man understands how he can be shaped, he can no longer be shaped unknowingly. You're not meant to rage. You're meant to see. Because there is one final layer to this descent, and it's the most uncomfortable of all. The system doesn't just test control on children and outcasts. Eventually, tests it on you. The reason this story unsettles you is not because it's about a plantation, or a widow, or a boy erased from ledgers. It unsettles you because you recognize the architecture. Different costumes, same design. And once you see that architecture, you realize something no history book will ever say out loud. The most effective cages are the ones men defend. Margaret didn't need chains at the end. She needed rituals, contracts, procedures. She proved that identity could be hollowed out gently, so gently the subject believes the emptiness is normal. That discovery didn't die with her. It was too valuable. It was absorbed, refined, and distributed into systems that now call themselves necessary. Education that rewards memorization over discernment. Work cultures that punish conscience with instability. Digital environments that train men to perform acceptable versions of themselves for social survival. All behavioral conditioning, all descendants of the same core insight. Shape the environment, and the man will shape himself. Subject 0's final disappearance wasn't an ending. It was a transition. Men like him become myths because myths are safer than records. Myths prevent audits. And here is the part you were never meant to connect. Awareness disrupts conditioning. The moment a man understands the levers being pulled, those levers lose power. That's why stories like this are buried, distorted, or dismissed as exaggeration. Not because they threaten comfort, but because they threaten structure. You listening to this is not passive. It's an act of resistance, not rebellion, precision. Calm refusal to be shaped without consent. Dangerous knowledge isn't about paranoia. It's about pattern recognition. The question now is simple, and it's one only you can answer. Will you live as a subject, or as a man who knows he's in the experiment? History is not finished. Control systems are still being refined. The plantation simply learned to travel. And once a man understands that, truly understands it, he no longer needs permission to think. That's why this knowledge changes a man forever. Because you don't walk back up the rabbit hole. You redesign the world you move through, with open eyes. Most men will watch this and move on. A few will feel something shift. If you're one of them, comment, I see the pattern twice so others know they're not alone. Then subscribe. Not for entertainment, for awareness. Because once a man understands how systems reshape identity, he's never controlled the same way again.